Just heal yourself, don't worry about they mess. I'm telling you, it's just fine. They could never see your shine, so forget them. Just go focus on the next dance. Don't be worrying about the next man.
Good evening and welcome to Talk of the Stacks. I'm Christy Pearson with Friends of the Hennepin County Library. Thank you so much for joining us for our kickoff of the 2024 season. As we begin, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement on behalf of the library and friends. We acknowledge that in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. By offering this land acknowledgement, we commit to recognizing Indigenous nations and to holding ourselves accountable to the work of reconciliation. Thank you. I'd next like to recognize our wonderful sponsors who help make this free series possible. Many thanks to the Star Tribune, Ice House, and LSE Architects. Well, tonight we are thrilled to have with us the incredible Ijeoma Oluo, author of Be a Revolution. But first, I wanted to let you know about two upcoming free author events happening at the library. On March 19th, Talk of the Stacks will continue with best-selling novelist Tommy Orange, author of There. Orange will share more about his new book, Wandering Stars, with special guest moderator, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Louise Erdrich. It's an evening of literary conversation you won't want to miss. And on April 25th, Anthony Ray Hinton, best-selling author of The Sun Does Shine, will join us at Minneapolis Central Library for a conversation with Star Tribune columnist Myron Medcalf. Mr. Hinton's book was recently selected as the spring read for the Mary Ann Key Book Club, an anti-racist reading group founded by Mr. Medcalf in partnership with Hennepin County Library with support from friends. Both of these events will be presented in hybrid format, which means there are in-person and virtual viewing options available. So be sure to click the link in the chat to register for these free events today. Oh, and one final note, at the end of tonight's talk, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question this evening, simply click on the icon marked Q&A at any time. And now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's guests. Tonight's moderator, Lissa Jones, is a culture coach, thought leader, and host of the podcast Black Market Reads. Our guest of honor, Ijeoma Oluo, is a writer, speaker, and self-proclaimed internet yeller. She is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, So You Want to Talk About Race, and more recently, Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. She was named to the 2021 Time 100 Next list and has twice been named to the Root 100. In her latest work, Be a Revolution, How Everyday People Are Fighting Oppression and Changing the World, and How You Can Too, Oluo offers an eye-opening guide to anti-racist activism. It is my great pleasure to welcome Lissa Jones and Ijeoma Oluo to Talk of the Stacks.
Thank you, Christy. I'm delighted to be here. Welcome, Ijeoma. How are you?
Hi, it's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. For people who might not have read your book, let's please start with, how would you characterize it? If we're in a small talk conversation and somebody says, well, what is your book about? How would you describe it?
You know, I would say that this is a book that kind of answers the what can I do question. What can I do about systemic oppression? And it doesn't answer it with here's step one, here's step two, but it starts first with what people have already been doing, and then invites the reader to join where they see fit, where their interests or talents may lie.
I love that. Thank you very much. That is perfect, obviously. You talk in the first chapter, sort of punishment, accountability, and abolition, about needing to learn a new language. Would you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I started the book off with talking about punishment, accountability, abolition, because if you don't understand this basic fight for freedom that abolitionists are in, the rest of these fights, the rest of these chapters, you're going to miss a huge part of it. at core, the fight for liberation is what all of the movement workers in this book are fighting for, and what so many of us, around the world have been fighting for. And so understanding what that means in the context of our systems and how we live is really, really important. And part of that means unlearning the way in which we talk about conflict, the way we talk about safety, the way we talk about accountability, the way we talk about revenge, and really learning something that is really liberatory in practice and kind of puts us in the right direction towards freedom.
You say that white supremacy robbed you of your imagination. I wonder, I do believe I understand it for myself, but I would really like to have the audience understand, what do you mean?
I think that this is actually a really powerful tool of white supremacy. It's this insistence that we see time and time again that the systems we have, the world we have, is the best we can hope for. At most, we can tweak it, but nothing better could be come up with, and nothing better exists. And really taking away our power to imagine something new and better is so damaging to us on multiple levels, not only because it really does stop us from thinking about whole solutions to these really big problems, and solutions that are more inclusive, solutions that can really help people, but it also makes it so that we don't see what's already being done outside of our systems that is truly created. And so we hear this a lot from people, especially when we're talking about things like violence or talking about racism. People will say, well, what can we do? I mean, there's only so much that can be done. We can't toss the system out and try something else, because we're told time and time again that it doesn't exist, it's never existed, and it can never happen. And that's not true. And it's a really dangerous belief that we don't often investigate. And so there are so many ways that even those of us who are trying our best to fight for freedom and to fight against all of this harm get stuck in this idea that, oh, at best we can just tweak what exists a little bit. And that's really heartbreaking, because every day we're seeing beautiful creativity in movement workers and in our communities to try to care for each other and keep each other safe, especially where our systems are harming us or failing us.
In fact, that's a beautiful through line of the book, is that you do show that there are people who are real people, not these people we can mystify, in some time ago, but people who are living right now who are actually moving against these things. What do you think is most misunderstood about the word abolition and its meaning?
I think that people often simplify it. They look at one small part of it. So many people, when they think abolition, right, they're thinking about the abolition of slavery. And it's actually not wrong to think that, because modern day abolition is a continuation of this work. And it's really founded in the idea that our current prison industrial complex and many of our other carceral systems are a continuation of chattel slavery. And so abolition is the continuation of that fight and saying we aren't there yet. It didn't end with, the legal abolition of slavery, because slavery continued in these other forms, and the, exploitation of people continued in these other forms, and we're going to continue to fight it. But a lot of what people miss is it's not just let's get rid of the harm. It's let's build something in its place, something healing, something freeing. And often when we talk about abolition, people get very afraid because they're stuck in that first part, and then they go, then what? If we don't have police, then what? And the then what is actually something that abolitionists spend a lot of time in, because that's the part we can start building right now, even while these systems exist. We can build the then what. We can build, these free spaces, these safe spaces, these healing spaces, and people are doing that work every day.
That's what I think was most fascinating to me, is that all the things we miss in our daily practice. We focus on the harm and the traumas that result, but not on the people who are taking movement against it, who are making, change. You talk about the idea that we try to box up oppressions. Can you talk about that? Try to put oppression into boxes?
Yeah, and we see this all of the time. And I think part of it is, one, I think just the way that academia loves to look at things, right? And people are like, well, is this book about this? Is this book about this? And are we debating this topic or this topic? And if you do any of this work, or even if you're someone who likes to talk about something like systemic racism, or does that because you have to, The question of, well, I really think that's class, or I really think that's gender, as if, these things exist in these silos. The truth is that the powers that be, the systems that benefit from our oppression across the board, you're going to find often the same people and the same entities at the head of all of them. Right. So the same people that benefit from, trans misogyny, benefit from ableism, benefit from racism, benefit from classism, and they're going to perpetrate it. And it may look different depending on which community they're targeting, what aspect of the community they're targeting. But it really is a linked oppression. And then it's also important to remember that we exist in multiple ways and in multiple identities. And so there really is no way that you can look at something like systemic racism and not be looking at sexism, not be looking at ableism, not be looking at classism, not be looking at transmisogyny and queerphobia. These are things that you end up looking at because all of these people exist in our communities as well, and the same power structures are impacting us all. And so I really want people to understand, like, the names, the titles we give things, these are things we made up. And it helps us, right? It helps us have context. But these aren't like set, from on high and says, this is a racism, this is a sexism. These are systems that are crafty and creative and work together to ensure power. And we have to be creative and we have to work together to ensure our freedom.
I love that because it is a call in. It's saying, you know what, you can do something, whoever you are, in whatever way you are, and however many intersectionalities you show up, you can help and change something that we made up. You inspired me to think about James Baldwin. Language can invent anything, right? And so we can invent new language for the new ways of thinking about things in abolitionist frames. And I think that's really what you're positing.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important that we recognize that at the end of the day, the names we give things, it's about the meaning we give things, right? And so people will say, well, are we going to call it this? We know, at the end of the day, what oppression looks like and what oppression feels like. And yeah, we will give it a name so that we all feel like we're on the same page. But the way in which we can kind of get into these debates to death over, is it this, is it this, is it this, even when none of these names will fully suffice, because we're talking about people, we're talking about all of these variables that grow and change with time. It is really important that we really look at the intentions and look at people's actions and say, I know when people are standing with me. I know when they're listening to me. I know when they're seeing all of me and saying, I will stand with you, and who comes to harm you comes to harm me as well. Like, at the end of the day, that's really what we want, right? And we will try to do work from our place of expertise, our interests, or our need. And knowing that we can stand next to people who are doing the same for their expertise, their interests, their need, and know that they stand with us and we stand with them is really the end goal that we want here.
Thank you. You talk a lot in the book about harm and creating safe spaces for care and compassion. Will you help our audience understand a bit about the context of harm and the context of care in that way?
Absolutely. I think it's really, really important to understand that our communities that are targeted by these systems, we are being harmed on multiple levels, right? We're being harmed directly by these systems, but also the way in which this harm compounds intergenerationally can often turn us into agents of harm as well. And so that's harm done to us that we then in turn can do to others or ourselves. And so there is a lot of harm here. And so for movement workers within these communities, it's even further impacted because we are trying to fight harm done to us in our communities in the harm. We are sitting in that trauma while we are harmed and trying to fight it directly and staring at it directly. And, when it's your work to sit in these spaces, it can be very harmful. And so a lot of times what we forget, and there has been, this has been deliberate in some ways. We forget that our care is a huge part of this, that part of when we say we deserve to live, it's not just we deserve to survive. How we live matters. And that is a statement, that is a powerful statement we can make every day by saying, the healing must happen while we are doing this work, because we have to show that we are worthy of joy right now, even while these systems exist. We are worthy of rest and care. And so that is a very powerful part of our work, and something I try to tell people all of the time, especially, people in my community, especially Black women who are often tasked with really carrying a disproportionate share of this labor, is that if we get to the end goal and we deconstruct these systems of oppression and we crushed ourselves in the process, we will have lost. And so it is really vital that we recognize how important care is, and the basic fact that that is something that we can only do ourselves. People with more privilege can protect our spaces of care, can create space for us to do that work. And they can do that by doing their work, by saying, I'm going to engage my community. I'm not going to have the least privileged people try to fight these powerful systems alone. I'm going to do my work. So that way we can do the work of healing ourselves and our communities. And that work is so important if we're going to be able to win this battle.
I find myself doubly inspired from reading the book and now hearing you. Thank you. It reminds me that labels make things visible and invisible. I sort of think about BIPOC sort of makes a whole group of people invisible, and at the same time, perhaps maybe more visible. But you in your book do make things visible. And I'm thinking about the intersection of the hierarchies of body and mind, disability and race. It's something I don't hear very often in our community, about the intersections of disability and race. What made you write about that? Why talk about that, even though I have done my homework and read the book? So,
I would say this was one of the most transformational sections of the book for me. So I have been in community. A lot of the community movement workers that I have known, that I've called friends, for years, are disabled BIPOC. And yet you can work alongside someone, talk theory, and then not fully sit in the work they do. And so I had never considered myself a disabled activist. And where, intersectionality, where we stand in solidarity with each other, my, comrades who were disabled activists were doing their work and I was doing my work, really sitting in it and saying, oh no, I really want to know what is behind this, was so eye-opening for me, even though I had been in community with many of these people for a long time. And so recognizing even the lens with which many of the disabled BIPOC activists I talk with view race and disability, and really many stating that they viewed racism as a function of disability, because we're talking about hierarchies of bodies and minds, and the fundamental idea that there are certain bodies and certain minds meant to be exploited, meant to be crushed and controlled, that are dangerous, that are unworthy, is fundamentally an ableist idea. And so how that impacts our communities in particular, especially Black and Indigenous communities, means that we are impacted by systemic racism and ableism all of the time, regardless of whether we are disabled or not. But further, it means racism itself is disabling. And there is, we will be more likely to be disabled in our community. We do have disabled family members. Disability is our community. We are a disabled community. And recognizing that and moving away from the fear that capitalism and ableism has, that says we have to prove that we can always be this capitalist idea of productive, always be worthy in these ways that white supremacy has decided our bodies and minds must be in order to deserve to live, is something that we have to let go of. And we have to fully see and embrace our community and recognize that if we aren't looking at the ways in which disabled people in our community are harmed by these systems, and the ways in which we are all harmed by ableism, we will never be able to do effective work.
I really appreciate you going into that kind of depth, because that was one of the most transformative, though it was all transformative. My thinking is informed very differently now, but certainly I hadn't thought about our community in a disabled way because of racism. in the intersections of all the things, as they say. Right now, people often argue, what does the past have to do with the present? And so I bring this point up, a finer point perhaps that you're making in the book because of the context of the present, racism and labor unions. This idea that suddenly labor unions are wonderful and they're good for everybody, but you write about some other kind of thing going on in labor unions. Will you help people understand?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say we are at a really exciting time for labor unions. And it is a time where we are seeing this reckoning with the racist past that many labor unions have. And so I am clear in the book that we have had some labor movements that were always Black and Brown led, that always stood in solidarity with marginalized communities. But then we have the majority of labor unions that time and time again would really harm themselves rather than upend any racial hierarchies and rather than, lose this status for white men in their labor unions. And so it is really important that we look at that, because when we look at the real decline, and it has been a drastic decline of labor unions in this country in the past decades, part of that is the fact that some of our largest workforces don't feel represented by labor unions, and in fact often feel harmed by labor unions. And so people won't fight for a labor union that isn't going to fight for them, that isn't going to look at what a deep impact things like racism, ableism, sexism have on workers. And so if that's not going to be addressed by a labor union, why would you give up part of your paycheck to that union? And so looking at this resurgence of labor activism that we have seen since 2020, when we saw that those most impacted in the labor force by the ongoing COVID pandemic were Black and Brown workers, were disabled workers, and younger workers who were saying, this is not worth the $15 an hour you're giving me, you're killing me. And coming together and not only saying we want protections, we want wages that befit the essential workers that you say that we are, but also we want to address the racism here. We want to make sure that we can get a promotion that we deserve. We want to make sure that we are all seen and heard, and all of these issues that we are having are addressed. And so we have this really beautiful, exciting labor movement in places like Starbucks, Amazon, and smaller ones as well, all throughout the country, that are Black and Brown led, women led, youth led, and they are listening to workers. And at the same time, it's so interesting because the established labor unions, many are reacting with fear and hostility because they're seeing, their relevance declining. And the relevance isn't declining because these young workers are doing such amazing work. The relevance has always been declining. It just wasn't as obvious because they just thought that this is where they were, and they could blame other people for why labor unions were declining as much as they were. And so it's so interesting how, time and time again, we have seen labor hurt itself in order to not address white supremacy. And we are at an opportunity right now where labor can really grow into this movement and embrace what's coming, or it can make a decision that's made in the past. And so it's whether or not it wants to learn, and I really hope it can. But I will say, whether or not the broader labor movement wants to learn, these younger workers aren't stopping and waiting for them. They're going to keep pushing forward. So it's whether they want to come along or not with what's coming.
It's beautiful to me that the young people continue to lead always the movements of the future, and that is wonderful and heartening to me. Lately with all the wildfires and smoke going everywhere across the country and all the things that we see on climate change and floods and such, what does the environment have to do with it?
It has, in looking at environmental activism and looking at, a lot of these kind of doomsday predictions that people have about the environment right now, what's been so interesting to me is the difference when you step into BIPOC-led environmental justice movements. We aren't talking end of the world. We're talking, how can we hold our communities together and be safe and get justice for the ways in which we are being targeted and have been targeted. And so what we really have is a difference between often what we call mainstream or white environmentalism, which is the fear of what will come, and environmental justice, which is addressing what is already here. and has been impacting our communities for a long time. And that is far more effective because that's the seeds of what, people of privilege fear will come to them. What people fear will come to them has already been hitting Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities all over the world. And they have been fighting, not only fighting these systems, but fighting to create solutions to keep their communities safe and healthy. And so looking at that and the difference between that has been so important to my understanding even of it, because often there's times where I'll be giving a talk about, race, and there will be like a white person who will raise their hand and be like, none of this is going to matter if we're not going to address the climate, and I'm like, it does matter, because racism is actually at the core of how environmental destruction is allowed to flourish, because for decades, if not centuries now, what has been building up to the catastrophe that we are in right now has all been built on the backs of our more vulnerable communities and our Indigenous communities. Whereas the practices that actually sustain the earth, as well as, the responsibility for the vast biodiversity on this planet, have long lived with our Indigenous communities. And so it's really, really important that we recognize and support that. And currently, funding around environmental activism, the vast majority is going to these major white-led organizations. And so little of it is going to the groups that are actually on the front lines right now fighting these important battles.
The wrong doctor writing the wrong prescription for the wrong problem. That's a short Dr. King. Yes, thank you. I love it. What about race education and the pedagogy of our oppressors? I think education particularly is one of those issues that was past, now is present, and will always be in the future, no doubt. Talk to us about that intersection, if you would.
We are in a crucial time around education. And it's not the first time, of course. I think, as you have said, throughout the history of this country, a lot of the battle for racial equity and the battle against racial equity has been fought through our education system. When we think about our future, we are thinking about often our children and how our children see the world and what they will expect from the world. And our schools are vital for that. White supremacy has been a part of our education system since before the founding of this country. And it is really, really important that we acknowledge that, that the reason why this current assault on education, where we literally have history being banned and outlawed, the seeds of that, the reason why it was so easy for that to take hold is because of the inherent white supremacy that already existed in the system. So we have to acknowledge that. But education is so important. It's so vital, not only on the individual impact it's having on our children and our young people, but also how we see each other, how our cities and towns function, how we define ourselves and our world. It is vital. And so this battle that has been able to weaponize a small amount of fearful and racist people to show up at city council meetings, to show up at school board meetings, to run for school boards and outlaw education, is one that hasn't been met with anywhere near equal outrage that people would dare do this, or with anywhere near the support for true education in our schools. And that is very alarming for me, because this has been spreading and it is absolutely everywhere. And it is so important that we address it. The goal of this, I firmly believe, honestly, the goal of all of this fear-mongering around, critical race theory and trans inclusion in schools, the goal is to resegregate our school system, to resegregate it so that there is a future generation locked into these fascist ideals and beliefs, where older generations that are afraid of change can ensure that their young people will not be taught any new ideas, will not understand how the world works. It is a losing strategy, but it is a strategy that extends the life of great harm. And that's harm for every student of every race and every ethnicity. So this is really, really vital. And I would say, for me personally, as a mother, the reason why this sits in my heart so heavy, the reason why I speak of it with so much urgency, there are a lot of things we can hit. We can go to someone who was fired for their job unjustly and say, here is a settlement, here is a thing we can do to repair. You cannot go to an adult and say, here is your childhood back. Here are your developmental years back. We just can't do that. And so every day that we ignore this, we are letting a child go through these systems feeling unsafe, unseen, unheard, with no idea of the future that they could build, that they could be a part of. And that is unacceptable for me. It is an emergency for me every single day. And I really want everyone, regardless of whether or not you have kids, and if you have kids, regardless of what race or ethnicity they are, to understand how deeply damaging that is to us all.
It's so true. And it seems to me that ever since Brown versus the Board and public education, there has been a design to decrease the education in public education. Going back to Baldwin, education, if you're white, is indoctrination. And if you're Black, subjugation. It teaches you your place in society. And it's very dangerous that we are back to the same ideas without any concern for diversity, equity, and inclusion, except as an alternative force that's not good. Arts, race, and the creative forces of revolution. I don't think people think about the arts very much in terms of Black people necessarily, unless it's something cool they hear or, a fly flavor that they see. But talk about the arts and the importance of it in our community, in healing, in repair.
And that was honestly one of the more fun chapters for me to work on, to talk with people that are really at the creative heart of movement work. And you're right. I think in our communities, we don't get to talk about the arts often in this. We of course enjoy art. We are very artistic people. I would say we are the artistic engine of this entire country, if not the world. And yet, I grew up incredibly poor. And as a poor Black girl, oldest child, the thought that I was going to be a writer was something I set aside at 5th grade because it wasn't going to pay the bills, And I didn't start writing until my 30s. And it's important to understand that I'm not even mad about that because I get it. When we look at the stats and look at how little the arts is supported, I'm not even talking about in our communities. Like if you have all the support of your entire community and then you try to get your work in a gallery, good luck, try to go to an art school, good luck. All of these things, the ways in which the racism has infused the arts as a sector, as a way that people could provide for themselves while creating art, there is deep, deep racism in that. And yet, the way in which we define revolution, the way in which we envision our future has always been designed by artists. And when we think about, what do we do in a march? We sing a song, we have a chant, we paint murals, right? We are constantly envisioning a future, envisioning justice, finding ways to communicate our heartache when words fail us, right? All of this is done through art, but also it's a very, very powerful form of protest that cuts across language barriers, that doesn't need a particular level of education, that doesn't need a particular amount of money to be able to access or understand. And it is time that we really recognize and respect art as the revolutionary tool that it is and has been in our communities for hundreds of years. And even when I think about, as a Nigerian American, I think about the through thread of art and song that connects my ancestors in Nigeria with, descendants of slavery here. And think about how that survived and how that was, when everything else was banned, carried through and carried stories of liberation, carried a connection to home. That is the power of art. And we have to support and nurture it because that is indigenous to us. It will always remind us of who we are and where we're going and what we're trying to build.
It's tie that binds, right? From the continent all the way to this place. It's tie that binds. Yes. A life's work. You seem to be called to this, regardless if you want to or not. You're an internet yeller. So tell us, what does that mean? And how did you get called into this life's work? And how come you didn't want to answer?
Yeah.
Or did you want to answer?
You know what? No, I really felt like I had to. I don't know many people who say I really want to, I don't know many, okay, I will say I don't know many people of color, especially Black people, who say, you know what I really want to do every day? Talk about racism. Like we just don't want to. It's painful. we actually search for any other reason, you know, and there are times where my kids will tell me something that happens maybe at school. And I'm searching, like, please let it be something other than race, please, because I don't want that heartbreak for them. I don't want that hardship for them. We don't want to have to fight that battle all of the time. And yet this is the work that I do every single day. And it absolutely does feel like it's the work I'm supposed to be doing right now. And I really got into it from a place of need and a place of deep heartbreak. And it was really the murder of Trayvon Martin that pulled me back into writing. And it was really this feeling that I was in such deep grief and fear. And I was looking around, you know, my Seattle hometown and my workspace, where all of these people would brag about voting for this particular candidate and recycling every day. And yet I saw none of the same heartbreak, none of the same fear. And I realized, oh, this isn't community. There is a line here where people recognize that it will never be them. And therefore they won't stand next to me. They won't try to fight this. They won't try to look at their own neighborhood and say, what can we do right here? And so that's really where I started writing, is because I had to know that there was a way that I could find community. There was a way that we could get people to address, you know, where I lived, the racism that was making what happened to Trayvon feel so immediate, so real, and so endangering for me, for my brother, for my children, and for people that I loved. And so it was a really deeply personal space of me just trying to find different ways to put this into words, almost begging people to understand that this isn't an issue of you live in Florida, therefore you're in danger. It's an issue around the country that all of us, all Black people, feel so deeply. And so that's really where my writing started. And it was really, I had no intention of becoming a writer, intention of like becoming a known figure for this work. It was a real genuine feeling of, I'm going to go crazy if I can't get people to acknowledge that this is real. And that's really the place that the work started from. And from that, you know, not only did it grow, not only did first people in other people, Black people in Seattle, start to respond and say, this is exactly how I'm feeling. You're voicing a thing I haven't been able to put words to. But then it allowed me to fully come into my experience as a Black queer woman in a way that often we don't get to, because for our own safety, we often kind of shut parts of ourselves away. And I had this space where I got to be whole. And, you know, I wrote in So You Want to Talk About Race, you know, once you see yourself, you can't unsee it. You know, you can't lock yourself away again. And it really changed me and how I walk into every room that I'm in. And then there was just no turning back. It was that, or I was going to end up getting fired from every other job I had, because I couldn't be, you know, quiet. I couldn't laugh off a joke. I couldn't do any of those things anymore, because I had started saying the truth. And it just wouldn't go away after that.
I recognize the price you pay as another Black woman, and I thank you for being willing to do it, because it matters.
Thank you.
Mental health and well-being as resistance. It's something that, to me, you have centered on as a means by itself of being a revolution. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, you know, and it's something that I work on, that I struggle with personally, that balance, letting go of this idea that we're supposed to continuously martyr ourselves for this work, that we're always supposed to be in service of each other and never ourselves. All of the, you know, that we're never supposed to rest, that we can't find joy. If oppression still exists, how dare we have joy in our lives? All of these are things that I battle all of the time. And prioritizing myself as part of the people that I'm fighting for is really difficult. It doesn't come naturally to me. And it's something I've had to make a practice of. But, you know, as I was talking with all of these movement workers, you know, some of them have been doing their work for 3, 4 years, some of them 20, 30, 40 years. And knowing that all of them went through these cycles of realizing it's too much, I'm burning myself out, I'm in too much pain, I'm too disconnected from myself or my community right now. And coming through it and trying to find a way to do this for the long haul, shifting gears if need be, going to therapy, reconnecting with community, shifting the work that they're doing completely for something that suits where they are and what they need in that time. It was so important to see all of the different ways that people who have been doing this work long term had to come to that, to realize, oh, this work will still be here for me in a different way, but I better find a way that works for me if I'm going to keep doing this work. And so recognizing that and, really putting a plea out there to prioritize it, having grace for the fact that so many of us have to learn the hard way, that, it is really, really important. And I do love this shift that we're moving into these days, that is saying that community care, right? Because there is a difference between community care and self-care, that community care in movement work is one of the most important aspects of movement work. And that is something that we really have to do a better job of prioritizing, because these are precious, precious members of our community. Every member of our community is precious. And the idea that we have some that we sacrifice to this battle is just not acceptable. We have to treat us all like we are who we're fighting for.
That is critically important. And to me, that piece was like liberation theology, out of the idea that we need to be a broke down, living in the bad way, to be down for the people type thing. And then we end up broke down and no life. And we do not have to live like that to fight for liberation. We can create care for each other. I hate that our time is so short. And I would like to ask, as sort of, perhaps it might be my last chance to ask this question. How did you become aware of the people who were working on solutions? Because many times people say, I'm aware of all the problems, but never the solutions. How did you get aware?
Yeah, part of it, I think, was luckily, the growing up in Seattle is a very, very white city. It's a very white city. And what that does mean, if there is a silver lining to living in a place like this, and there was a lot of harm in living in a place like this, is that our communities are very tight-knit. Right. In fact, it's so small and so tight-knit that no one can afford to be one thing. So your arts community is going to be de facto an activist community because of the amount of activism you have to do to create art space in an overwhelmingly white area, right? And so that overlap, it has been really constant in my life here in Seattle, even as a writer, and looking at the writing spaces that publish Black writers here have to be activist spaces just to exist, right? And so recognizing that helped introduce me to some people. And then it was really about recognizing that there are people behind every story. This fundamental truth that I've learned over the years, which is that we do not suffer in silence, that everywhere we see an issue, there are people who have been working on it. And so that was me looking at, stories around the country and saying, what is happening in this space? Okay, there are people behind this, and who are these people? So part of that was networking. Part of that was saying, so-and-so knows someone in environmental justice. Okay, do you know someone who's actually working on this issue in this area? And making those connections and asking every movement worker I talked with, who's inspiring you? Who are you learning from? Who do you want to see on these pages? It really helped me understand how connected all of this work is, how beautiful and broad and diverse this work is, and just, how creative our communities are in building solutions, and how much work they've done and continue to do that will never make the front page, and yet it's holding communities together and making sure that people have food on their table, have a safe place to live, are finding, non-carceral solutions to conflict and harm, all of these things that matter so much to us. The reason why we exist in a system that really wants us dead is this work that has been happening generation after generation.
This is fantastic. Thank you. The questions and statements are lining up in the chat. To the viewers, please feel free to continue to put your questions and thoughts in the chat, and we will get started. Is that okay, Ijeoma?
Yes.
Thank you. You have been wonderful, and I just want to be able to say thank you. I don't want to miss
so
being able to say that. Thank you. Heidi's asking, saying, thank you for your generous conversation. Curious if you have thoughts that tie to the concept of community care with the role that parents have to model and teach the next generation. Do you have guidance for parents in our community on solution building?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I love working with young people is one of my absolute favorite things. One, because kids are so creative, right? Kids have not had, these decades of being told this is how it has to be. So I find that if you just give kids a little bit of like foundational ideas and let them run with it, they go wild and they come up with beautiful solutions. So one thing when I'm looking at, systemic harm, it's important to recognize that systems come in all sizes. And, when I'm talking with young people, I try to get them to see their friend groups as systems, their classrooms as systems, their church groups as systems, their families as systems, and ask them to investigate the dynamics in these spaces. These are all microcosms of what we see in society. And when you do that, and then you can show kids where their power is within those systems, you are making the world a lot less terrifying for them. You are making them feel a lot more empowered, because right now our kids live in a world where the grown-ups are making all of these horrible, disastrous decisions, and that can be really scary. And so going into a classroom and saying, if you were to come into this classroom every day and feel like everyone here is seen and heard and safe, what would this classroom look like to you? And watch kids brainstorm what their books would look like, what the classrooms would look like, the chairs would feel like, what their teachers would say to them, what they would say to each other, how they would handle an argument, and writing it all down and watching them feed off of each other and bounce ideas off of each other and realize that they can design this space, that they have power in this space, is one of the most beautiful things. And it's something that every kid can be invited into. And it's so important that we do this, because one thing I always love to stress when I'm talking, especially in schools, is if your kid said that, they wanted to be an engineer, you would make sure they had a math class. And yet we say, oh, my kid's going to be anti-racist. My kid's going to be a great, beautiful member of society. And yet we don't teach it and we don't give them practice in it. And so doing that and just having them step into their power in the spaces that they're in so that they can actually see the results of that work is one of the most beautiful things you can do. And you can learn from it. Every time I do these sorts of exercises in classrooms, the thing that is always amazing and hilarious to me is watching teachers just light bulbs going off of things they never considered doing in their classrooms. And it's the students coming up and saying, oh, this would actually be ideal for me. This would help me understand this topic more. This would help me feel seen here. This is what I want to be learning. This would make me come to class every day. And the teachers are like, wow, I had no idea. And so it's really important to remember how we have to teach. These are skills that we can teach, and that these are empowering skills. There's a lot of fear mongering around talking around this. The world is scary, and our kids have access to the news and the internet. So teaching kids how the world works and giving them a smaller example of that to actually step into their power in it and create positive change is the opposite of scary. It's so empowering and hopeful, and it really gives them a positive outlook on the future that they're going to be stepping into.
I love that, because also one of our audience members, Becky, said, I'm 9 years old. Can I be an activist? And I think you just told Becky what she can do.
You absolutely can, Becky. And that I'm so excited for what you'll be able to do in your classrooms or with your friends or with your family.
I love that. Andrea, forgive me. I always go back to Lilia Watson's quote that your liberation is bound up with mine. How do you address folks who, when talking about Palestine, say it has nothing to do with our justice work locally in the US? And if you do not want to take this question, you do not have to.
Oh no, I will take it happily.
Okay,
Absolutely. Yeah.
okay.
I mean, one, it's really clear that it is connected, and it's connected on multiple levels. One, because we ourselves live in a settler colonial state that legitimizes itself in its solidarity with other settler colonial states, and legitimizes its abuse of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people by supporting the abuse of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people around the world. And Israel is no exception to that. But it's also important to recognize that a lot of the real harm done by our carceral systems, by our police forces and armed services, is in collaboration with Israel and the harm it does to the Palestinian people. And so not only is technology being shared, but training is being shared, and the justification of harm against us is being shared as well. And so it is really vital that we recognize that they know that it's connected. And that's why we have, our country is such an, fervent supporter of the genocide that is happening in Palestine right now, because they know that this success of this project will enable the success of violence against Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples here in the US. We have to understand that our liberation is connected. We have to understand that everywhere that this sort of violence is allowed to continue endangers us all. And that the more that we work together, the stronger we will be. And the more that we can raise awareness of it, the more free we all can be.
And I think about the idea that we have a relative idea of safety, but if we're not all safe, no one's safe.
Yeah. And we're seeing this already, right? Because when we're looking at the laws that people are trying to pass to make it so that our students can't protest, that our students can't say, end this genocide, do people really think that's going to stop with Palestinian student groups? Absolutely not. These laws are going to come for all of us, where none of us are going to be able to protest. Once that's put in place, they can apply it rapidly. And we are already seeing it going the opposite way. We're seeing in Atlanta where protesters who are fighting to stop the building of Cop City, trying to save their environment, are being charged with RICO charges right now. Right. Well, now those threats are being laid against Palestinian activists in the US as well. So we see how connected it all is. And so we have to be aware. We have to stand together. We have to recognize that these systems are global, but they have multiple hands and they will touch down wherever they need to really secure power. And so we have to fight it everywhere that we see it. And if we don't want to be alone in this battle, and we can't be, we are a minority in this population. We cannot be alone in this battle. We can't leave others alone in their battle as well. We really do have to stand together. That is where our power is.
The poet Elizabeth Alexander outside of the Legacy Museum says we've yet to breathe free air.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a powerful and profound concept to me.
Mm-hmm.
Dan writes, I've ongoing debates with a friend about systemic racism. My friend claims that all examples in literature are from 30 years ago or more. I'm just not even going to comment on that. Part of my response was that often these aren't recognized when currently implemented. I presented the NFL using different criteria for Black players in determining head trauma. Can you share other areas of systemic racism that are currently occurring that may not be visible to those who don't experience it personally? That's a very large question, so maybe an example or two, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, I mean, if you're saying the examples are from 30 years or more, chances are that current literature isn't being read. We're all writing about it. I've written about it. There's, every study I've used is a current study. It is so important to look at these basics. The number, one of the top indicators of health, wealth, well-being in this country is the color of your skin. And so when we look at things from, Black kindergartners and preschoolers being 4 times more likely to be kicked out of preschool than white students. And, these sort of numbers going all the way through, the chance that I will have of dying in childbirth, right? That is something that exists to this day. And so I would say, like, that is a disingenuous argument that your friend is making, that your friend is deliberately avoiding looking at the current day situation, because there is an overabundance of evidence, not only in our lived experiences, but data that all of us cite, that you could pull up any of our books and see, or any article and click on those links to know that this is absolutely happening today. And it is just as bad, if not worse, than what we saw 30 years ago, whenever this person last checked the data.
Beautifully stated. Kristen writes, so much of white Minnesota, like Seattle, we're very white here. I mean, people have culture shock. Black people coming here, they're like, what in the world? So we get down like Seattle. So much of white Minnesota was shocked when George Floyd was killed, and by the protests that followed. The pain our city experienced offered an opportunity for some of us to engage with racism in a way we hadn't. Now that it's been some time, there's less urgency to this conversation and work. How do we continue to encourage people, particularly white people, they write, towards the immediacy of this work when they have always had the option to disengage?
I'm gonna paraphrase Dr. King, because I don't have the exact quote in my head, but he said something along the lines of that, white people will do something about racism when it is intolerable to white people. And so it is really, really important that you be part of why it's intolerable to white people, that you do what you can to remove those barriers, and that white people regularly engage with the lived reality that Black people have in this country and other populations of color have in this country in your local area. And that means, looking at who you're getting your news from, really asking what is happening in our schools, in our neighborhoods, in our towns, in our state, and bringing that. Be the person who keeps putting that in front of people. But then it's also really important to just recognize how you're contributing to that. White people are often very afraid of finding out how they're contributing to it. And in 2020, there were a lot of white people who were marching in the streets because they wanted to feel better about what they saw, not because they wanted to find out how they were participating and really leverage their power to make different choices that could make a difference. And so it's really important to recognize that you will continue to do harm whether you want to recognize it or not. The difference is whether you want to do something about it. So ignoring it doesn't mean that you're not doing harm. It means that you're just doing it unchecked. Engaging with it gives you the opportunity to do something better, gives you the opportunity to be the person that you want to be, that you think that you want to say that you are, gives you the opportunity to be more fully in community with people in your community, and to really say that you are on the side of liberation. I shouldn't even have to say this, but it's true. Systemic racism harms almost everyone, regardless of race or ethnicity. It is a direct contributor to ableism, to classism. It locks everyone in their place in these exploitative systems. And if you want to be free, even as white people, if you want to be free, you have to be anti-racist, because what you are refusing to acknowledge and address in systemic racism is keeping you locked in your place in an exploitative system.
We may not have come over in the same ship, but we are in the same boat now. You got it. Last question, so sadly, but so grateful for your time. You speak so movingly about the power of artists and profile many in your book. Do you have any additional artistic muses that you recommend we watch, follow, or see?
Oh, okay. So here's the thing. I have ADHD, and every time someone says, "Do you have a name for a thing?" my brain completely seizes. So what I would highly recommend people do, honestly, is just find where I exist on social media, click on what I'm following, and try to go through it and say, oh, that is, that there's a lot being done there. But I will say that two of the artists that I profiled in the book, Fabiana Rodriguez and Raphael Shimunov, are both doing amazing things with art right now to address what's happening in the world, to address what's happening in Palestine. So Art v. War actually just puts out some amazing guerrilla art that people can download and share and use as a form of protest. Fabiana Rodriguez is regularly using art as protest and art to empower community. Click on that, look at that. But yeah, also if you just want to know where I'm getting, a lot of my day-to-day interaction from, go into my Instagram, click on what I'm following, and you'll find a lot of makeup in there. You'll find a fair amount of fashion, but mostly what you're going to find are people doing the work and people who are really inspiring and keeping me going.
I love it. The last word is going to be yours. What I would like to know is, what would you like to leave this group with? What if it's the last thing they think of and the only thing they remember? What would it be?
I would say, in working on this book, the thing that made really clear for me is that I'm not afraid of uncertainty anymore, because the beauty and the creativity of every human being that I spoke with is a testament to the fact that we will be okay so long as we are leading with love and standing with each other. And that means that if I woke up tomorrow and I couldn't write another word, there would still be a place in the movement for me. And I would still find a way to do meaningful work. And there is a place for absolutely everyone who wants to be in it. So don't be afraid of the uncertainty. Just jump in and know that people will be really happy that you're there.
Ijeoma Oluo, we are the luckiest that you are writing, that you are doing all the things that you are doing. Please come back again, and thank you for being our guest tonight. We are so grateful.
Thank you. This was a really lovely conversation. I really appreciate you.
I appreciate you too, and thank you. Please feel free to purchase her lovely book, Be a Revolution, Be a solution could be another word for it, could be another title for it. Be a solution. She's inviting us to be a part of the movement for change, to think like abolitionists. Anything is possible. We don't have to be bound by what's here today. Please buy her book for Majors and Quinn. And thank you to the Hennepin County Libraries for hosting this wonderful event. And thank you to all of our guests for being here tonight. We appreciate you. My best to everybody, and mostly you, Ijeoma. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.